Stop right where you are. I need to tell you about two empty chairs. Keep watching, because what happened next changed my life forever. I was standing in my dress blues. Diploma in my hand. Cameras flashing all around me. And the two seats saved for my parents in the front row were empty. That night, still in my uniform, my sister posted a photo online. Balloons. A cake with soft white frosting. My parents laughing. My mother holding our family dog like it was a newborn baby. The caption read, "Best birthday ever." I stared at that photo for almost 10 minutes before I understood something that changed my life. The dog's birthday mattered more to them than mine ever had. My name is Lily Parker. I'm a major in the United States Army. For most of my life, I believed a quiet lie. If I worked hard enough, if I won enough awards, if I made myself impressive enough, my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at my younger sister, Sophie. It took me 30 years to understand something painful. No achievement was ever going to buy me that look. That look was never for sale. I grew up in a house that smelled like fresh flowers and old money. My father, Thomas Parker, built a real estate empire from nothing. He made sure everyone knew it. My mother, Margaret, ran our home like a stage show, always watching to see who might be looking. From the time I was old enough to tell the difference between being loved and being ignored, I understood one thing. Sophie was the star. And I was somewhere in the background, holding a prop. I remember being 12, standing in the kitchen with a certificate in my hand. I had won the top award in my whole grade. I ran home breathless, sure this was the moment. My father looked at it, nodded once, and went back to his newspaper. 2 weeks later, Sophie brought home a participation ribbon from a spelling bee she hadn't even placed in. My mother threw a small party. There were balloons that time too. I stood in the corner of our dining room. I was 8. I was confused. What did I do wrong? It never stopped. Not in middle school. Not in high school. Not when I got into a strong university. Not when I decided, despite everyone's quiet disapproval, to join the army instead of a softer, safer career that would look better at their dinner parties. My father never said he was proud. He said things like, "That's an unusual choice for someone like you. I hope you know what you're doing." Sophie couldn't hold a retail job for 6 months. My parents called her a free spirit finding her way. Then I met Michael. Michael Reed was nothing like the men my parents had quietly been pushing toward me since I turned 22. He was the son of an electrician. He taught high school history 40 minutes outside the city. His salary made my mother's eyebrow twitch the first time she heard about it at dinner. But Michael was steady. He listened when I spoke. He remembered small things about me I hadn't even realized mattered. He made me laugh in a way that felt like breathing out after holding my breath for years. My parents hated him immediately. I remember sitting in my father's study, the air thick with leather and old cigars, when he told me plainly, "Our family doesn't marry people like him." Not, "We're worried about you." Not, "Tell us more." Just a flat statement, like he was talking about the wrong contractor. My chest tightened. I unclenched my jaw before I spoke. "I'm marrying Michael no matter what you think." My father simply said, "Then you're on your own," and went back to his paperwork the same way he went back to his newspaper with my certificate all those years ago. They came to the wedding. I'll give them that. They sat in the second row. My mother in a pale blue dress. My father in a suit that probably cost more than Michael's first year of teaching salary. They smiled for photos because appearances mattered more to them than almost anything. But afterward, at every gathering, every holiday dinner, my father found a way to repeat it. "You married beneath yourself, Lily." He said it so many times it stopped sounding like an insult. Just a fact he mentioned, like the weather. I told myself I could live with it. I told myself my career, my marriage, my quiet happiness would drown out his voice. I was wrong about that too. The advanced officer training program I completed years later was one of the hardest things I had ever done. 14-hour days. Weeks away from Michael. Moments when I genuinely wondered if I had anything left to give. When I stood on that stage in front of my peers and the flag, I wanted more than almost anything for my parents to be there. They told me they would come. I believed them. I kept looking at those empty chairs throughout the whole ceremony, telling myself they were running late. Traffic. An emergency. There wasn't. There was a dog's birthday party with balloons and a cake with white frosting, posted online for the whole world to see. Timestamped to the exact hour I was receiving my diploma. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I did something far more permanent. I picked up my phone and blocked every number. No calls. No emails. No letters. No social media. Total silence on my end and theirs. 5 years passed that way. Then my phone rang. A number I hadn't seen in half a decade lit up my screen. Henry Walsh. My father's longtime attorney. I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. Your father needs one signature, Henry said. His voice was careful. Almost apologetic. Tell him he lost that privilege 5 years ago, I said. I meant every word. A long pause. Please, Henry said quietly. Just hear me out. Henry had known my father for over 20 years. He'd never once called me directly. Every interaction growing up had gone through my father first. So when he asked to come to my house in person, I felt something shift in my chest. Not hope. Something more like caution. I told him yes before I could talk myself out of it. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. A dark sedan that looked out of place on our quiet street. Michael was outside, sleeves rolled up, replacing a fence post that had rotted through the winter. He wiped his hands and shook Henry's hand with the easy warmth that had once made my father sneer. I saw something flicker across Henry's face. A quiet reassessment. We sat at our kitchen table, the one Michael had built and sanded on weekends after long teaching days. I made coffee. Henry looked around at our small kitchen, the photos on the refrigerator, the modest lived-in comfort. He seemed to be searching for something he expected to find and hadn't. You have a nice life here, he said finally. I couldn't tell if it was an observation or an apology. We do, I said. It's ours. He nodded. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. The kind that makes your stomach tighten before you read page 1. He slid it across the table. Your father needs your signature. It's related to estate matters. Your grandfather's trust. What kind of estate matters? A formality really. Thomas just needs to update some of the trust documentation. Your signature is required as one of the beneficiaries. I opened the folder and began to read. Let me be honest. I've spent years learning to catch small details others miss. The Army teaches you that the difference between disaster and safety is often buried in one overlooked line. So when I started reading that document, I wasn't reading it the way my father assumed I would. He expected the daughter who used to accept whatever he handed her. That daughter didn't exist anymore. The language was thick and confusing on purpose. Filled with legal phrases designed to stop careful reading. References to waiver of beneficiary interest. Restructuring of distributive shares. Clauses that circled around each other without ever saying plainly what they meant. I read one paragraph 3 times and still couldn't tell you in simple English what it was asking me to give up. Henry sat across from me, his fingers tapping lightly against his coffee cup. A small rhythm of impatience. Every few minutes he'd glance at his watch, then catch himself. Take your time, he said, though his tone said the opposite. I intend to, I said. The more I read, the more something in my gut told me this wasn't the simple formality he was describing. There was a section buried on the 4th page about adjusting primary distribution percentages. It seemed to shift a lot of weight away from equal shares. Equal shares between who, exactly? The document didn't say plainly. It was written assuming I would sign quickly. Trust the process. Trust my father. I looked up. This says my grandfather made this trust. Not my father. Correct. Your father has managed it on behalf of the beneficiaries since his passing. Managed it. Not owned it. Correct. Then why does he need my signature to change how it's divided, if he doesn't have the right to change it in the first place? Henry paused just slightly too long. It's more complicated than that. There are clauses that allow for adjustment with beneficiary consent. Whose consent specifically? He didn't answer that one. That silence told me more than anything he could have said. I closed the folder slowly. I'm not signing this today. Lily, your father was hoping this could be resolved quickly. There's time sensitivity. I understand, I said. I understood perfectly. Someone wanted this signed fast, before I looked too closely. I'd spent enough years learning to spot urgency used as pressure. I'll have my own attorney read this before I sign anything. For the first time since he walked through my door, Henry looked genuinely surprised. Not offended. Just visibly caught off guard, as if the idea that I wouldn't simply comply had never occurred to him. I found my own attorney within the week. Her name was Julia Bennett. Sharp, methodical, the kind of quiet confidence that makes you trust her in 5 minutes. I handed her the folder and told her everything. She called me 4 days later. Lily, I need you to sit down for this. I was standing in the kitchen. The dish towel was still in my hand. Something about her tone made me lower myself into a chair. Your grandfather set up a trust nearly 30 years ago. It is very specifically built. I want to walk you through exactly what it says, because I don't think your father ever expected either of you to actually read the founding documents. She explained that my grandfather, a man I remembered only faintly as a quiet presence at holidays who preferred fishing to conversation, had set aside a large part of his estate in a trust. Meant explicitly for his grandchildren. Not for his son. For me and Sophie. Split evenly. To be distributed under specific conditions. My father had been named trustee. Responsible for managing the assets wisely until those conditions were met. But management, Julia explained carefully, was not ownership. What he did not have under any circumstance was the power to change the division of the trust on his own. So what was I being asked to sign? I asked. A voluntary waiver. You would be signing away a big part of your beneficiary interest. The split would be reworked so Sophie receives most of the trust's value when it's finally distributed. Why would he need my signature at all? Because the original trust clearly protects equal division unless both beneficiaries agree otherwise in writing. Your father cannot simply give Sophie more. The only way that happens is if you sign away your share on purpose. Which is why there was pressure to move quickly. And why the language was written the way it was. Designed to hide exactly what you'd be giving up. I thought about Sophie's birthday parties. The participation ribbon. The balloons. The dog's birthday cake time-stamped to the exact hour I stood on that stage in my dress blues. I thought about every quiet small moment over 36 years where I'd been told I mattered less. And I understood. This wasn't new. This was simply the biggest, most consequential version of a pattern that had been there since I was old enough to know the difference between being loved and being tolerated. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. I'd spent years bracing for a moment like this. And now that it had arrived, I didn't feel devastated. I felt clarity. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I understood exactly what my father wanted and exactly what he was afraid of. He was afraid of me saying no. He needed my compliance, my old habit of trusting him without question. He had built an entire document around the belief that those habits still lived in me. They didn't. Not anymore. What would you like to do? Julia asked. I thought about the empty seats. I thought about the years of silence I'd built for myself, brick by brick, not out of hate but out of need. I thought about Michael outside, fixing our fence, the quiet steady life my father had once called beneath me. Something close to amusement stirred under my calm. I'd like to see how desperate they become. Julia didn't say anything right away. Then, almost like respect, understood. We won't sign anything. We'll let this play out. I hung up. I sat there staring at the folder. For the first time since I was a little girl standing in that dining room with a certificate nobody cared about, every card in this game belonged to me. I felt patient. And somewhere under that patience, quiet and steady, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again where my family was concerned. I felt ready. The call started 3 days later. My father's number, still saved in my phone under a name I hadn't looked at in 5 years, lit up my screen 4 times in one afternoon. I let it ring every time. Then the texts, short and clipped when he still believed he held all the leverage. Lily, call me. This is important. By week's end, the messages had changed. Longer. More urgent. My mother started calling too, something she rarely did without prompting. I'll admit the first time I heard her voice crack slightly on a voicemail, something old and tender flickered in my chest. Then I remembered how many of her tears had been saved for things that mattered far less than my graduation. Sophie called on a Tuesday evening while Michael and I were washing dishes. I watched her name flash. I let it ring. She called back 4 more times within the hour before texting, "We need to talk. This affects the whole family, not just you." I didn't respond. 5 years of silence had taught me that responding only opens doors easier left closed. It was my father who escalated properly. Henry called Julia directly, asking for a formal meeting at a restaurant of my father's choosing. White tablecloths. A wine list longer than most menus. I agreed to go. Michael offered to come. Part of me wanted him there. But I told him no. This was something I had to do alone. My father was already seated when I arrived. A glass of scotch in front of him. His suit pressed to that sharp shape I remembered from every important dinner. He stood. Offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Gestured for me to sit, as though 5 years hadn't passed. "You look well," he said. The first thing he'd said to me in half a decade. A comment on my appearance, not an apology. "I am well," I said. He tried the soft approach first. Family. How much he and Margaret had missed me. How time heals if people let it. He never mentioned the empty seats. Never mentioned the dog's birthday. As though the last 5 years had been bad weather that simply passed, not a silence I'd built because of his choices. When I didn't respond the way he wanted, his tone shifted. "Sophie needs this, Lily. She hasn't had the advantages you've had. The stability. The career. She needs this distribution to get her life on track. I built my stability myself. No one handed it to me. You're already successful. You have your career. Your husband." His voice dipped. The old familiar condescension surfacing. "Your simple little life. Why do you need more?" There it was. Same phrase, different clothes. Married beneath yourself, dressed up as concern for my sister. But underneath, the same old message. I was successful enough to not need what was mine. Sophie was needy enough to deserve what was never hers. I reached into my bag and set the folder Julia had prepared on the table between us. The full breakdown of my grandfather's original trust. The clear language protecting equal division. The section my father had hoped I'd never read. His polished look cracked. "Where did you get that?" I read it. All of it. Every word my grandfather wrote. His jaw tightened. I watched him recalculate. Watched him finally understand the woman across from him wasn't the daughter he'd controlled. I stood up before he could recover. "No," I said. "Just that." I walked out without looking back, leaving him sitting with his scotch and his folder. For the first time in his life, no answer ready. The legal letters started arriving within 2 weeks. My father hired an outside firm and began what Julia called an aggressive posture. He filed motions. He questioned the validity of my refusal. He argued, in thick legal language, that my grandfather's original intent had been misread for decades. Julia read every filing with patience. Each time she'd call afterward, calm. He is grasping. These arguments do not hold up. He is hoping the cost will make you fold. Sophie took a different approach. Cryptic social media posts at first. Some people only care about money. Family means nothing to some people. Then posts naming me directly. Selfish. Stealing what our grandfather intended for her. Abandoning our family for 5 years and swooping back in only when money was involved. Old high school friends reached out. People I hadn't spoken to in a decade. Suddenly curious. Is everything okay? Sophie posted something concerning. I didn't respond. I'd learned that explaining yourself to people who had already decided rarely accomplishes anything except exhaustion. Instead, Julia and I let the paperwork speak. The original trust language. The clear clause protecting equal distribution. Records showing my father's management fees over the years, fees that, upon closer look, appeared to exceed what the trust's own rules allowed him to take. That last detail, buried in financial statements Julia's team pulled out in discovery, seemed to change something. Henry called me directly. His voice sounded different. Tired in a way it hadn't been. Lily, I need to ask you something. Did you know about the management fee problems before this started? No. My attorney found them in discovery. A long pause. I have represented your father for over 20 years. I trusted his version of things. I believed him when he said this was a formality. Another pause, longer. I don't think that is true anymore. What made you change your mind? The fee statements. And something else. He asked me to draft language that would hide the redistribution clause even more after your attorney started asking questions. He wanted it harder to spot. Henry's voice caught. I have drafted many documents for your father over the years. I have never drafted one designed to fool a client's own daughter. I think I need to reconsider my position entirely. I sat with that. I stared at Michael in the yard, patiently teaching our neighbor's kid how to throw a proper spiral. Steady. Kind. The kind of person my father had called beneath me. Thank you for telling me. I think, Henry said slowly, your father lied to me about the nature of this whole request from the very beginning. The final negotiation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of Henry's firm. My father had asked for it there. He wanted home field advantage. The polished mahogany table. The wall of windows. My father arrived exactly on time. Dressed perfectly. The posture of a man who had never once doubted things would go his way. Sophie sat beside him, arms crossed, refusing to look at me. My mother wasn't there. She'd chosen, once again, to remove herself from the uncomfortable parts. Henry sat at the head of the table. Quieter now. Barely making eye contact with my father. Whatever loyalty had existed between them for 20 years had begun to crumble. My father opened with confidence. I think we can resolve this quickly. He slid a revised document across the table. Reasonable. Fair to everyone. I picked it up and read. Julia sat beside me, quiet and watchful. The document was dressed in softer legal language, but the underlying structure was the same. A redistribution. A restructuring. And my father had added one more layer of protection for himself. A clause giving him continued authority over distribution timing even after redistribution took effect. Language designed to keep his hand on the trust forever. I read it once. Then again more slowly. Something caught my attention. A phrase buried in a smaller clause on page 3. Language my father had clearly added himself. I felt it before I understood it. The way you feel the shape of a joke before the punchline. I read it a third time. I cross-referenced it against the original trust. The one my grandfather had written decades earlier. I laughed. Not polite. Real. The kind that catches you by surprise. The kind that made Henry sit up straight and my father's jaw tighten visibly. Did I miss something? Henry asked. I turned the folder and slid it across to him. I tapped the clause. He wrote this himself. Didn't he? This exact language right here. Henry read carefully. Then again. I watched the exact moment understanding hit him. His shoulders dropped. His mouth opened, then closed. My father, in his eagerness to lock in permanent control, had added a clause granting himself ongoing management authority that directly contradicted an ironclad rule in my grandfather's original document. A rule that explicitly said any attempt to grant the trustee authority beyond simple distribution would void the trustee entirely and trigger immediate full distribution to beneficiaries under the original equal terms. He had not just failed to take more from me. He had accidentally triggered the exact clause that guaranteed I would receive my full original share immediately, with no further trustee involvement from him at all. In trying to lock in permanent control, he had written himself completely out of the equation. He had restored the trust to exactly the equal division my grandfather had intended. Henry set the document down. His face pale. He's not getting any of it, he said quietly. Almost to himself. My father snatched it back. Scanned it frantically. This is a clerical error. This isn't what I intended. It is exactly what you wrote, Henry said. Something final in his voice. I told you not to add that clause without letting me review it first. You insisted on handling it yourself. Sophie looked between them. Utterly lost. Still waiting for someone to explain. My father sat there. The folder in his shaking hands. The color draining from his face. Undone by his own greed. By his own inability to let things stay equal, the way his own father had always intended. I sat back in my chair. Still catching my breath from laughing. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. Far more satisfying. The judge finalized the distribution 6 weeks later. Almost quietly. My father's clause was exactly what Henry said. A fatal mistake he'd made himself. The court upheld my grandfather's original language without hesitation. Equal division. No trustee discretion left. No more room for anyone to quietly tilt the scales ever again. Thomas lost completely. I want to be honest. I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. I thought watching him lose would feel like justice, loud and complete. Instead it felt strangely small. Almost quiet. The way real endings to long fights often do. He wasn't a villain in a story anymore. He was just a tired older man who had spent his whole life mistaking control for love, and had finally run out of ways to disguise the difference. Sophie called about a month later. Quieter than I remembered. She didn't fully apologize, but said something close to it. Something about realizing she'd never actually had to build anything for herself, and not knowing what that meant about her now. I listened. I didn't offer forgiveness I didn't feel yet. But I didn't hang up either. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut. They can simply be left open for whatever future version of a relationship might one day walk through. My father asked to meet twice after the ruling. Both times I said no. Not out of cruelty. Not even entirely out of anger. I said no because I finally understood something that took me 36 years and one dog's birthday party to learn. Closure doesn't always require a conversation. Sometimes it just requires the decision to stop waiting for one. With my share finally mine, the way my grandfather had always intended, I made choices that felt more like me than anything my family had pushed me toward. I built a scholarship fund for children of active duty service members. Kids who move every 2 years and rebuild their whole lives over and over, without ever being asked. I contributed to a program supporting families who had lost a service member. And because Michael had spent over a decade pouring himself into a profession that paid him far less than he deserved, I donated a significant amount to teacher training programs. The quiet, unglamorous work of shaping young minds that so rarely gets celebrated. None of it was about proving anything to my father. That part of me, the part that spent years hoping my achievements might finally earn his approval, had died somewhere between an empty seat and a dog's birthday cake with white frosting. What I built instead was just an extension of the life Michael and I had already created. Quiet. Steady. Entirely our own. I still think about that ceremony sometimes. Standing in my dress blues. Scanning the crowd for two faces that never appeared. I used to think about it with a tight aching feeling in my chest. Now it feels more like remembering an old photograph of someone I used to be. Someone who still needed something from people who were never going to give it. Michael and I stood in our backyard the evening after the final paperwork was signed. Nothing dramatic. Just the two of us in the fading light. The fence Michael had repaired standing steady behind us. Coffee warm in my hands. No mansion. No fancy parties. Just the quiet ordinary peace we had built for ourselves, brick by brick, the same patient way I'd once learned to build anything worth having. You okay? Michael asked. Watching me the way he always did. Like my answer actually mattered. I'm good, I said. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I meant it completely. The funniest part of this whole story isn't that my father lost. It's that he spent 5 years believing I still wanted his approval. Still needed him to finally see me the way he'd always seen my sister. The truth is I had stopped needing that the exact night he chose a dog's birthday over his own daughter's graduation. Everything that came after was simply him finding out, one legal document at a time, exactly how long ago that door had already closed. If you've made it this far with me, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to love you no matter what, just to finally feel like yourself again? I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and whether any part of this felt familiar. Leave a comment below and let me know. We have so many more stories like this to share right here on Twisted Family Revenge Stories. So if this kept you company today, tap that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep walking this road together.